Good evening, I'm Stan Grant. There is growing speculation of an imminent ceasefire in the bloody Israeli-Gaza conflict. Senior Hamas officials say hostilities could end within days. Now, these are live pictures of Gaza where it's just gone 1 p.m. Once again, plumes of smoke have risen above the city for the 10th straight day. There are reports of airstrikes and sirens warning of rocket fire in this strife-torn region. US President Joe Biden is calling for a de-escalation, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to continue military operations until, quote, quiet and security is restored. Gaza's Islamist rulers, Hamas and other militants, have vowed defiance. We're going to get more on this now from our Middle East correspondent, Tom Joyner, who joins us from Jerusalem. Tom, what have you seen today? We've just had these reports of more smoke above Gaza.
Well, Stan, there's been no let-up in Israeli airstrikes over the Gaza Strip in the last day. Just this morning, at least one Palestinian killed and several others wounded. The Israeli military says it's targeted and struck a number of homes belonging to Hamas commanders, as well as other military infrastructure in Gaza. Now, elsewhere in the Strip, the humanitarian situation there is quickly deteriorating, and as it has been over the last few days. There's just so much damage to public infrastructure and to buildings. We're talking schools, hospitals, clinics, even the electricity supply, which was already inadequate before this latest round of fighting began, is even worse now, providing only a few hours of power to families in Gaza each day. On top of that, medical supplies dwindling, tap water undrinkable. It's really a grave situation. Now, on the other side of the border in Israel, those rockets fired from Gaza have also continued. Yesterday, one of them striking a residential area in the border city of Sderot, injuring one man, and this morning striking a vehicle on the Israeli side of the border. No one was critically injured, although one Israeli soldier did sustain injuries due to shrapnel from that blast. That brings us today, from what we understand, a death toll in the Gaza Strip of 230 Palestinians, according to local health authorities. And on the Israeli side, 12 Israelis dead.
Tom, there have been suggestions already from the Palestinian side that a ceasefire may be imminent. There's pressure coming from the United States. What's the state of play with that right now?
Well, Stan, when we talk about a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, we're really talking about two competing narratives here. On the one hand, you have the constant stream of rumours of unattributed sources, of anonymous officials speaking on background in media reports and on social media, always seeming to point to an end to the hostilities just over the horizon. On the other hand, you have the official narrative. In Israel's case, that's a consistent refusal to back down on military operations over the Gaza Strip in the last 11 days. Now, the US President Joe Biden has spoken yesterday to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That's their fourth phone call in just a week. Now, Mr. Biden told Mr. Netanyahu that he expected a significant de-escalation today in the hostilities, moving towards a ceasefire. However, Mr. Netanyahu responded soon after by saying that he intended to press on with Israeli operations until their aims were met. Now, the US has led these international efforts to broker a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, but so far they've come up short. They haven't achieved an end to the fighting. The reality is it's really hard to know what those backroom talks, what those behind-the-scenes discussions look or sound like. But it is clear that we're going to need a clearer signal from the Israelis that they're willing to stand back from these hostilities before we see a ceasefire eventuate.
We'll be getting comment in just a moment on that from Jerusalem. Tom, thank you for that. Tom joining us live there from Jerusalem. Well, coming up, we're going to talk to former US Ambassador to Israel, Martin Indyk, and we're live to both sides of this bitter conflict in Jerusalem and the occupied territories. We'll also talk to an Australian doctor on the front line of this humanitarian crisis. First, though, let's take a look at how this endless cycle of violence has unfolded. The explosions in Gaza and southern Israel echo through history. Israeli and Palestinians divided in a land violently contested. Buildings in parts of Gaza are being flattened by an Israeli bombardment, while Palestinians rain down rockets on Israel. The toll of dead and wounded rises daily. To understand what is happening now, you must go back to 1948, when the State of Israel was founded. After the Nazi genocide of the Second World War, persecuted Jews travelled from around the world to Israel, looking for a new home.
The resolution of the DAC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against.
Arab states refused to recognise the new Jewish homeland, tipping the region into generations of conflict. After war in 1948 and again in 1967, Israel increased its territory. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were forced from their homes in what they call the Nakba, or the catastrophe. In defiance of United Nations Security Council resolutions, Israel built settlements for its people in the newly acquired, occupied territories. Thousands of Palestinians took to the streets in the first uprising, or Intifada, in 1987.
We are protesting and demonstrating against harassment. Stay calm together.
Nearly 2,000 people were killed, mostly Palestinians.
The PLO parliament, the Palestinian parliament, the PNC had accepted two states, Palestine state and Jewish state, between brackets, Israel.
A year later, the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, surprised the world by denouncing terrorism, recognizing Israel's right to exist, and authorizing the beginning of the Land for Peace negotiations. He began talks with new Israeli leader Yitzhak Rabin.
Prime Minister Rabin, Chairman Arafat, Foreign Minister Peres, Mr. Abbas, welcome to this great occasion of history and hope.
Secret negotiations in Oslo, Norway in 1993 resulted in the signing of the historic peace declaration. 2 months later, at a rally in Tel Aviv, Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist, and the Palestinian peace process stalled. The Islamist group Hamas grew stronger in the void. Hamas launched a wave of suicide attacks against Israeli targets.
We condemn it. We hold the Palestinian Authority responsible for giving it the green light.
How is it going, Mr. President?
In 2000, US President Bill Clinton tried to restart the peace process with an Israeli-Palestinian summit at Camp David. It quickly fell apart, failing to resolve issues of borders, who owns Jerusalem, and the rights of refugees. It sparked the second Intifada. The 5-year uprising was much more violent and deadly than the first, with more than 4,000 people killed. In 2005, Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas and Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon announced a suspension of hostilities.
We have agreed that today President Abbas will declare a full cessation of violence against Israelis anywhere.
Israeli troops withdrew from the Gaza Strip after 40 years of occupation. But they still control the airspace, coastal waters and key border crossings. After Hamas seized control of Gaza in 2007, Israel tightened its blockade. In 2008, heavy rocket fire from Hamas against Israeli targets prompted Israel to launch a 22-day onslaught against Gaza, leaving 1,400 Palestinians and 13 Israelis dead. Violence flared again in 2014, ending with an uneasy ceasefire brokered by Egypt.
I'm very, very happy that it happens, but I'm very doubtful about the effectiveness of this ceasefire, because it could be that this is the 14th ceasefire that we are getting in.
The two sides dispute who owns Jerusalem. Israel claims it as its capital. The Palestinians claim East Jerusalem as the capital of a future Palestine. Settlements are another flashpoint, where Israel has built new homes for 600,000 people.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
Israel has erected an Iron Dome to shoot down 90% of the rockets launched from Gaza. It calls Hamas a violent terrorist organisation, hiding behind civilians, while Hamas claims to represent an oppressed people being victimised by the Jewish state. The violence continues. Six million people on both sides of the conflict caught in the crossfire. Martin Indyk is the former US ambassador to Israel, as well as the former US special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. I spoke to him earlier and asked him if Israel is any closer to announcing a ceasefire.
They don't have anything more to achieve. They've taken out Hamas's infrastructure, their set of tunnels, they call them metro, their underground operations. They've taken out as many of the heads of the different branches of Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad. And the IDF, the military, are basically telling the press and telling their American counterparts that they're done. So it's not clear to me what Netanyahu could achieve by keeping it on in the face of President Biden's insistence that he wrap it up.
There are questions, of course, here about the influence that the United States can bring to bear here. There was criticism of President Biden for quashing a UN Security Council statement calling for a ceasefire, that the US has not been able to bring a quicker end to this in the face of what we've seen as an enormous humanitarian cost.
Yeah, look, any humanitarian cost is terrible, and I don't want to make light of it, but it's not enormous, certainly not by Gaza standards. The last time we had to deal with this was 2014. It went on for 50 days. So it's terrible. I just think that we should keep that in perspective. And if President Biden succeeds in bringing this to an end after 8 days, it will have been because he stood up to the pressure to try to dictate to the Israelis, showed them sympathy for their need to defend themselves.
In the meantime, and as you say, perspective here and history would tell us that there have been even greater impact on human life and damage in previous conflicts. But we're still talking about more than 200 Palestinians killed, 64 children, 38 women, more than 1,500 people wounded, tens of thousands of people who've been left homeless, thousands of rockets being rained down on Israel as well. And then what? After this, what?
Yeah, well, that's the truly tragic nature of this conflict, which is that that we see this pattern repeat itself. 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021. And the Israelis say, well, it'll buy us 5 years, so I guess we'll be back here in 2026. The question is there some way to end this vicious cycle and resolve the conflict? And the problem is it's a kind of perennial conflict, which is extremely difficult at this point to do anything about.
And you know, as having been right at the centre of this, that there are political imperatives, that a hard-line stance in defending Israel and using insurmountable force is seen as a popular measure within Israel. Hamas emerges from conflicts such as this emboldened and even more popular, that the two sides remain even further apart. And then there are those intractable historical issues, the questions of rights of return, the questions of who owns Jerusalem, the questions of the holy sites, the questions of borders. As you say, then we're back again in 5 years potentially at another conflict. What can the United States do, as someone who has been in the thick of this, to try to bring an end to this impasse? Where do you begin after this latest round of conflict?
Well, you put the dilemma very well. And you can say that we've had two recent efforts to put an end to this conflict. One that I was involved in with Secretary of State John Kerry, which tested the proposition whether American willpower alone could resolve this crisis. The answer was no, because the leaders and the parties themselves were not interested, capable, willing to make necessary compromises. Then we had Donald Trump and his envoy, Jared Kushner, come along. And they tried some magical thinking and waving a magic wand, coming forward with a plan that sided with Israel on all the key issues, didn't talk to the Palestinians for 3 years. And guess what? That didn't work either. And I think we have to go back to an approach that is more gradual, incremental, step by step. In that way, perhaps we can come out of this, try to create some positive momentum, and further on down the road, maybe then we can look at approaching those final status issues.
Does this mean that a two-state solution is no longer possible? Is it time to look at a one-state solution with equality that avoids an apartheid state? And what does that then potentially mean for Israel as a Jewish state? Is the two-state solution past its use-by date?
Yeah, it is, except that all the other things that you mentioned aren't solutions. They're just recipes for continuation of conflict. Nobody surely can imagine that Israel is going to dissolve itself as a Jewish state with the principle of one person, one vote. I just think that these kinds of one-state solutions, that Hamas offers a one-state solution, which is the elimination of Israel. The right wing in Israel has a one-state solution, which involves annexation of the West Bank and somehow absorbing and giving some kind of faux autonomy to Palestinians living there, but not giving them equal rights in Israel. And that means Israel will remain a Jewish state, but it won't be a democratic state. So none of these ideas that are posed as alternatives are solutions. The kind of paradoxical reality is that the only solution is a two-state solution.
Martin Indyk, again, appreciate you giving us your expertise and sharing your time with us. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, joining me now is the senior advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Mark Regev, and he joins us from Tel Aviv. It's good to have you with us. Let's just ask the question directly. Is Israel right now prepared to call off the bombing of Gaza?
Well, we want this to end, but we want it to end right. If it ends wrong, we'll be back to square one and we'll have more missiles on Israel tomorrow, and we'll have to respond. So when this finishes, we hope it'll finish in a way that we can have a sustained period of quiet. A Band-Aid solution doesn't help anyone. It's a prescription just for further violence down the road.
What are you talking about in terms of time? Is it 24 hours, 48 hours? Is this the final stages?
Stan, I can't be too specific, and I apologize. There are a lot of moving parts here. But the most important thing for Israel is the result. We want to come out of this with an extended period of quiet where the Israeli population does not have to live in fear of an incoming rocket fired by the terrorists in Gaza. You know, we've had close to 4,000 rockets fired at Israeli cities. They are indiscriminately shooting at our towns, at our cities. They're trying to murder our people, and we're acting to defend ourselves.
When you talk about quiet, and yes, rockets have been raining down on Israel, and yes, there have been casualties, but does quiet mean 200 plus Palestinian dead, women and children? Does quiet mean more than 50,000 people displaced? Does quiet mean thousands of people injured, the loss of infrastructure, the loss of livelihood? Is that what success looks like?
No, success is achieving peace and quiet, returning calm, and allowing the Israeli people to not live in fear of an incoming rocket. We don't want to see any civilian casualties. We don't want to see Israeli civilian casualties. We don't want to see Palestinian civilian casualties. We don't want to see anyone caught up in the crossfire between us and the Hamas terrorists. But to be fair, Stan, Israel takes maximum effort to try to avoid hurting the non-involved, try to avoid hitting people who are not a legitimate target.
And yet we see people hit. We see people dead. More Palestinian dead right now, and the number increasing by the day.
But I think one of the reasons for that, Stan, is the fact that Hamas deliberately embeds its military infrastructure, its terrorist machine inside Gaza's civilian population. This can't be denied. And just as they celebrate the deaths of Israeli civilians, it's almost as if they celebrate the death of Palestinians because that's good propaganda for them. I'll give you an example. We know for a fact that some 25% of the incoming rockets fired at Israel fall short and land and explode in Gaza. They're killing their own people. They don't care.
You have seen this situation time and time again. Since 2007, when Hamas comes to power in Gaza, there have been multiple conflicts. There have been thousands of people who have died as a result and been injured as a result of these conflicts. Hamas is still there. So it's not about the removal of Hamas. We see these conflicts returning. We don't see any movement when it comes to any final solution. So what emerges after this?
So obviously we want peace. We want peace with all our neighbors, the Palestinians included. We've had over the last year, we had actually a few breakthroughs in the peace process, with Israel forging new peace treaties with 4 Arab countries, the Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. So there was some positive movement. The Palestinian track has been stuck. And one of the reasons it's been stuck is because Hamas, as you know, as you reported earlier, Hamas has always been opposed to peace and reconciliation. They say so openly. They say Israel has no right to exist, not in any borders. They say every Israeli civilian, man, woman, and child is a legitimate target for their terror. They say any Arab or Palestinian leader who makes peace with Israel is a traitor and should be killed. So we're talking about a group that is the enemy of everyone who wants to see peace and reconciliation here in the Middle East.
You would have just heard from Martin Indyk, someone you know well, the former American ambassador to Israel, essentially saying, we will be back here again in a matter of years, and also saying that the two-state solution looks like a forlorn hope, even if it remains still the only hope. Let me put that question to you. What does a settlement look like? Is a two-state solution still a potential and viable option? If not, what is an alternative?
Well, first of all, I want to say how we get out of this. Obviously, as long as Hamas is in power in Gaza, it's very difficult to talk about peace because Hamas, its whole essence is against peace and reconciliation. And as I said before, they proclaim that openly. So maybe the best we can get in the short term is some sort of peace and quiet based on Israeli deterrence. And that's why it's very important we come out of this current crisis, that Hamas is weakened, its military machine dismantled, and it's discredited amongst its own people. Because if we can show that the path of radicalism, the path of Palestinian extremism that Hamas represents, if that is soundly defeated, surely that can give more space for Palestinian moderates. And there's the answer to your second part of your question. We want to engage with Palestinian moderates. We want to find common ground. We want to find a deal.
Mark Regev, again, appreciate you giving us your time. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Stan.
Well, Natalie Thurtle is an Australian doctor working on the front line of this conflict with Médecins Sans Frontières, and she joins me now from the Gaza border. It's good to have you with us. You've been watching this unfold and having to treat people on a daily basis. What does it look like up close?
So obviously, as you've already alluded to, there's quite a heavy civilian casualty burden, including 30% of those being killed and injured are children. And so the Ministry of Health is seeing that in their major trauma hospital in Shifa. And we are now also seeing that in our service being provided in the north in Al Auda and in our clinics, which we've just managed to reopen today. So, look, it's difficult to reflect on the burden of this escalation as quantitative. I think I don't want to just focus on the numbers as was being discussed in the segment previously. I think that there's a huge impact on people's lives in terms of long-lasting injuries, and we see that from previous escalations in violence, but also on the infrastructure in Gaza. Gaza is already a place where the healthcare infrastructure is very fragile, where people are living in very low socioeconomic conditions, with 50% of people unemployed and below the poverty line. So you've got already a region that is completely on its knees as a result of the blockade and the occupation. And these kind of escalations just further deeply damage the population, their access to healthcare, their access to education, their access to life. And so it's not, from my perspective, it's not appropriate just to focus on what I think is already an enormous loss of civilian life and enormous injury burden coming out of this escalation in conflict.
What is it like, Natalie, to try to work in circumstances like that as well, for someone like yourself, and the resources that you need to be able to treat the numbers of people you're having to deal with?
So it's extraordinarily difficult for our staff on the ground. We've got over 200 staff in Gaza who are subject to the same conditions as the population. So they're being bombed nightly, having no sleep, losing their homes, losing family members. As you may be aware, our clinic was damaged by a bombing last weekend, and we've had to spend time in deeply insecure conditions doing a structural integrity assessment to see whether we can even open our service. We've managed finally to open it today. Supplies are not getting into Gaza. Additional clinical HR is not getting into Gaza, and so we've got tired doctors, tired nurses, limited relevant items as those items are being consumed, and no replenishment items are getting through the border. There's fuel shortage, there's electricity, water and infrastructure problems. There's now, as you referred to earlier, 72,000 internally displaced people, of which almost 50,000 have nowhere to go and are congregating in schools. So we have this situation where we were at the end of the second wave of COVID, but still seeing sort of 300 cases a day. And now people are congregating together with in situations that are not sanitary, and where they're not able to implement social distancing, etc. And so we expect very soon to have the third wave of COVID in Gaza, for which we're not even able to test at the moment because the testing centre was damaged. So really, it's very challenging to provide any type of medical care, but we are doing our absolute best, as are the other medical actors in Gaza.
And as you say, not just the impact of this latest conflict, but the things you're already dealing with and the ongoing stress and trauma that's going to emerge from this. Natalie, again, appreciate you sharing your time with us as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Let's go to Ramallah now, where Palestinian advocate Jahara Baker joins us. Jahara, let me put the question to you that I've posed to our other guests here today, and that is what the prospect of an end to this conflict now looks like and whether we could expect that in the coming days.
Of course, as a Palestinian and as seeing what's happening to my people in Gaza, I would like for Israel to stop the bombardment of Gaza. However, I think in the long term, as some of your guests have already mentioned, this will continue to be repeated as long as there is not a solution to the root cause, which is the Israeli occupation. I think it's very simple. It's not as complex as Israel would like to have us believe. But like I told you, what I want immediately is for my people to stop being slaughtered.
Johara, what is complex, though, is the politics of the Palestinian side. And we know that there have been accusations that there has not been a partner for peace, that there are splits within Palestinian politics, that there is the Palestinian Authority and the pressure on Mahmoud Abbas, there is Hamas, there were the cancelled elections, all of these things that contribute to the political instability that feeds into these conflicts.
I think to put it in layman's terms, I think that's a cop-out. I think that the political division is our own issue. We can deal with that. If you want to speak about elections, part of those elections, the problem why they weren't held was because Israel would not allow them in Jerusalem. Again, we need to address the root problem, and that is for the international community has a huge responsibility to implement what it has signed on to, which is international law. And under international law, Palestine is an occupied territory, and that occupation must end. And I think that it's been for way too long that Israel has gotten away with this. It's enjoyed impunity for way too long. And I think Palestinian politics, you can set that aside. We have had several occasions where the Palestinians have tried to be at the table, but that has always failed because there has never been a settlement that addresses the core rights of the Palestinians and their national rights.
Johara, isn't part of the problem too Hamas and rocket fire into Israel, which has also claimed Israeli lives and prompting also a response from Israel? Should we not also see an end to the rocket fire, the thousands of rockets that have been fired from Gaza to Israel?
You know, for me, it blows my mind that this conversation is not flipped on its head. The rocket fire or Hamas is a response to Israel is the aggressor. Israel is the one that always starts. The fact that Israel is the occupier and the aggressor means that the Palestinians are the ones who are defending themselves, not the other way around. The loss of innocent lives, the loss of civilian lives is always tragic. I'm not going to say it is not, but we have to shift that conversation to the fact that the Palestinians are the ones who are under occupation, and they're the ones who are always defending their lives, not the other way around.
Johara, we have seen failed peace negotiations in the past. We have seen a history of just this type of escalation and conflict. We talk about a two-state solution, and we see once again, time and again, that any move toward any viable two-state solution founders on those fundamental questions that we've listed throughout the program, those questions of history and borders and rights of return and who owns Jerusalem and all of those questions. Going forward, if you are looking for a final settlement here, is a two-state solution still viable? Who brokers such a negotiation? Do you have faith in President Joe Biden now to broker such a negotiation? And how do you begin to have those conversations with Israel, particularly after this latest round of conflict?
Right now, the two-state solution is not viable whatsoever. And I think the best answer to a question like that would be to refer back to international law. If there's going to be any credence to international law and resolutions, we need to use that as our reference. And international law will tell you that Palestinian territories occupied in 1967, they're occupied and Israel must withdraw from them. There's also the issue of Palestinian refugees. This conflict has been going on for 73 years. It didn't happen last week. It didn't happen when Israel was when they raided the Aqsa Mosque, when they tried to take people's homes from Sheikh Jarrah. This happened. This has been recurring, and it will continue to recur. So my answer to you is that since everyone seems to think that it's so complicated, there's a way to simplify it. Go back to international law and implement those resolutions that the international community were part in actually creating. I don't understand how difficult that is. And the reason why all of these peace deals have failed is because they are not complete. They do not address the core issue. They do not address the fact that Israel is the occupier and needs to end this occupation. I think that once the international community starts to take responsibility for that, then we can move forward. And again, to answer you again, I don't think that Joe Biden is going to solve the conflict at all.
Jahara Baker, again, appreciate you giving us your time as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Well, John Lyons is the head of investigative journalism at the ABC and a former Middle East correspondent for the Australian newspaper. He joins me now. John, this must look tragically familiar to you for someone who had spent years reporting just these types of conflicts in the past and has written extensively about it.
Yes, Stan. In the 6 years that I was based in Jerusalem, I covered 3 wars between Israel and Gaza, 2009, 2012, 2014, and now, of course, we have 2021. And you and I have both been into Gaza as journalists, but for the viewers who haven't, if I could just give a 30-second context, imagine half the size of Wollongong and 10 times the population. 2 million people in half the size of Wollongong. And the 2014 war, according to the Israeli army, just to give the viewers an idea of what it is like in the Gaza Strip. Israel said that during the 50 days of 2014, it dropped 6,231 bombs, missiles or mortars on Gaza, which is 365 square kilometres. So that's 17 bombs per square kilometre on average.
As you're speaking, we're looking at live pictures from Gaza and we can see smoke in the distance there again. And another day, a 10th day now, and we're seeing ongoing bombing of Gaza. And as you say, very small population. You've seen conflicts in the past where we've seen thousands of people dead or injured or displaced. We're seeing it once again. On the other side as well, I've reported the terrorist attacks, the bombings, the suicide bombings, the loss of life, and the thousands of rockets that we've also seen rain down from Hamas into Israel, which gives you an indication, doesn't it, John, of just how intractable this is.
That's right. And in that same period, Hamas fired, there were 4,594 rockets fired into Israel from Gaza, into civilian populations, essentially. But while we see the pictures, I think the problem with a lot of the media coverage is, you know, every 2 or 3 or 4 years, we see the bombings and the blow-ups and the rockets. There's not much analysis of the underlying problem. 3 times in your interview with Mark Regev, I thought it was very interesting. 3 times he said, what we want is quiet. What the Palestinians would say is for 54 years, the 3 million people in the West Bank have lived under military occupation, which means that the Israeli soldier is the ultimate authority. What they would say, those 3 million, is we don't want quiet, we want civil rights.
We've got just under a minute left, but to report something like this, you said in your book, you were on the side of journalism. How difficult is it to do journalism in a situation like this?
It's easily the most difficult place I've ever reported from. If you report exactly what happens, exactly what you see in front of you, you will be vilified, hounded and pursued.
John, thank you. Thank you for your reporting. Thank you for your comments here this evening as well. That is the program tonight. I'm Stan Gratt, and of course we're going to continue to follow this on the news, on News 24 as well. You can see more of this unfolding crisis across all of our ABC platforms, news.abc.net.au and on iView. Thanks again for your company.